Now, one of the most persistent claims that most naval historians who actually look at the 1920s and 30s and actually look at the period between the wars instead of just focusing on the world wars will deal with on a regular basis is the idea that the naval treaties were absolute collars around the necks of navies. And the thing was, you're not wrong when you say that. So you can't really argue point blank no. But the reality is so much more complicated, especially once you start to look at the way some of those powers use them. Now, the interesting thing, we regularly talk about the first naval treaty, the Washington Treaty, and how the Americans bugged the rooms and managed to really dictate terms and get things to an extent the way they want them, but then you look at the details and you go, actually, that kind of fits quite a lot of the British perceptions as well. Okay, yes, the British would probably like to finish off the G3s, and they, that wouldn't have cost them. They'd already paid for them, so frankly, they weren't going to bother about their cost. Sometimes people go, oh, they couldn't afford it. Not after World War One. It's okay. It's when you're dealing with post World War Two issues. The trouble is, and I never blame people when they have that perception, is that so many works and dramas and surface examinations of history just go, well, after World War Two we were in a terrible financial situation, and after World War One we just must have been in a similarly bad situation. World War One were not in a great financial situation, but were by no means anywhere near the level of post World War Two. The trouble is, most people looking back into it are looking back to it with World War Two, post World War Two eyes. That changes things. Okay, that changes perception. Once you looking back from a further distance and you're looking, going, yeah, for the British government at that time, with the maritime infrastructure industry they have, yeah, it's actually quite cheap for them to build. You can actually, when you're looking at it, honestly, pound for pound, the G3s were probably the cheapest order of battleships, or rather battle cruisers they were, that the British ever did. The British ever did. And the reason I can say that is because the industry at the time is trying to fight going out of business because they've all expanded also during the war. They were already on a massive industry. They're used to having a bulk order going through of at least 8 battleships a year. They got used to that steady diet in the run up to World War One. And suddenly the British government is ordering 4? I mean, that's not fair. They're all they're all being forced to compete against it. It's not when you've got the yard shrunk down, so it's basically a cartel of a couple of yards. You can set the price. No, there are about a dozen yards competing for those 4 ships. It's boom time as far as spending from the British government is concerned. It's a slightly different scenario when you're dealing with Nelson and Rodney. But the thing is, that's bad for the British. The British don't get the 16.5-inch guns. They don't get allowed the tonnage limitations that would allow them to build the G3s, and so they don't. And so that's the bad thing. But there are other things which are very good. One of them is that pretty much they don't have to deal with a naval race with the Americans, so they can afford to spend their money how they like, which, for the British government's perspective, is great. And the reason they don't have to deal with a naval race is because, with them capped at the same number, there are same tonnages officially. Most of the American politicians go, we have got a navy second to none. You haven't, because you haven't actually built it. But we have a navy second to none. You haven't actually built it, so you don't have it. You haven't paid for it. You've just got it on paper. The ability to have it, the right to have it. But that's enough for the politicians, because they can wave around and go, we have a navy second to none. And that's what they do, and they go away, and the Royal Navy goes, well, we're still bigger than them. Okay, carry on. Same business as usual. Right then, what crisis do we have to manage this week? And that is sort of the Washington Treaty. Once you get to the London treaties, it gets even more intriguing. And there are some things the British set up which are often portrayed as big losses for them. And then you look at the things they win, and you almost start to wonder whether the British government, in diplomatic terms, was doing a lot of dead cat scenario. They're putting up big targets to lose. I mean, yes, some politicians probably really were keen on the 14-inch gun idea. But barring that one, a lot of the other big sort of statement things they lost on when you look at the things they win in, it's almost like they're giving things for people to win and the battle and win the political argument, so they then concede on the other things which they don't really think are important. Good example of this is HMS Unicorn. And remember, Unicorn is not an aircraft carrier. I don't care what you look at when you see these pictures of the ship. She is not an aircraft carrier. She's a forward aviation support ship. She's an auxiliary, not an aircraft carrier. Her design might have been copied and pasted to become basically the light fleet carriers, but she's still not an aircraft carrier. She might have served in that role at Salerno and various other things, but she is not an aircraft carrier. She might have very interesting command and control facilities aboard her, but she is not an aircraft carrier. She might have even been a flagship for no less than Philip Vian. She's still not an aircraft carrier. And this, of course, is brought to you by, well, Tribals, Battles and Darings. Honestly, at the moment, this is what's bringing it to you. I've got a competition live at the moment. There's a link down below to a competition where there are going to be 2 autographed, personalised notes versions available, and it's a really cool competition. So please, if you click on the link down below, you will find, which is in the description down below, you will find a link to the competition. And it's a really cool competition. It is an absolutely cool competition. It's open to everyone who wants to submit. Should be fun. Now, I'm going to introduce you to one of those key examples, because you see, of things which make me seriously suspicious about the British. Seriously suspicious. And it's the text of the second versus the first London Naval Treaty. Now, I've written that as second versus first and then put the first and the second that way around, but there's a reason I wrote it that way. Because the second London Naval Treaty is actually the subject. The first is the comparison. But it makes more sense when I've got my hand out here to do it this way around. So I know it's confusing. But there is a reason behind my madness. There is a method behind my placement. So this is the thing which deals with larger auxiliaries in the First London Naval Treaty. Naval service vessels not specifically built as fighting ships, which are employed on fleet duties, or as troop transports, or in some other way other than as fighting ships, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun above 6.1 inch caliber, fine. Mount more than 4 guns above 3 inch caliber. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes, are designed for a speed greater than 20 knots, are protected by armor plate, are designed or fitted to launch mines, are fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. Mount more than 1 aircraft launching apparatus on the centre line, or 2, 1 on each broadside, if fitted with any means of launching aircraft into the air, are designed or adapted to operate at sea more than 3 aircraft. Now, that's pretty tight. That's in the First London Naval Treaty. That's the 1930 treaty. Then we have the 1936 treaty, which of course people withdraw from and basically gets ignored. But it's really interesting to consider in some regards of how it's written, because here's the same discussion, broadly speaking, on auxiliary. Auxiliary naval vessels are naval surface vessels, the standard displacement of which exceeds 100 tons, which are normally employed on fleet duties or as troop transports, or in some other way than as fighting ships, and which are not specifically built as fighting ships, provided they have none of the following characteristics. Mount a gun with a caliber exceeding 6.1 inches. Okay, that's stayed the same. Mount more than 8 guns with a caliber exceeding 3 inches. That's a dramatic increase. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes. Okay, staying. Are designed for protection by armor plate. Okay. What's the definition of armor plate? That's an interesting thing, that one, but basically it comes down to an armored belt. It's understood, informally at least, that magazines and things like that might need to still be protected even on auxiliaries, because, frankly, no one wants to go boom on a massive fireball, so no one's going to hold that against you. And there's an interesting discussion about whether deck armor counts, because aircraft can make a mistake. You know, it's a terrible thing. So all sorts of discussions around that one, which is why it's left as still armor plate. Are designed for a speed greater than 28 knots. Oh my! That's a dramatic increase. 20 knots is convoy speed, and Fleet movement speed. 28 knots is battle speed. Okay, this is now something which can operate with a fleet in combat, or at least keep close to a fleet in combat. Are designed or adapted primarily for operating aircraft at sea. Mount more than 2 aircraft launching apparatus. Okay. Interesting. Interesting. Now, on the surface, that can read pretty tight. That can. But if you were Admiral Henderson, 3rd Sea Lord of the Royal Navy from 1933 till his death in May 1939, and the Director of Naval Construction at the time, a gentleman called Sir Stanley Goodall, you would see that there is a path through this which has been carefully woven in. Very interesting path. A very interesting path indeed. Meets the Forward Aviation Support Ship. Not an aircraft carrier. Not an aircraft carrier. Was even potentially designed to be fitted with perhaps a structure on the deck to help with aircraft and to support aircraft maintenance, but not an aircraft carrier. Whatever you might think from looking at it, it's not an aircraft carrier. Okay, it's not. It's ordered in April 1939. Laid down in June 1939, launched November 1941, and commissioned March 1943. It's one of the last designs Henderson agreed, and had been worked on for quite a while. It came from the same design tree as the Illustrious class and the Implacable class and all the others of those designs, because it's a very similar design tree. And Ark Royal is also from that sort of designs tree. And the point you first have to realise is this is not an aircraft carrier. It's a forward aviation support ship. It's fitted with, well, how do I put this politely? It's fitted with flight deck and a resting with a sort of a flight deck with a resting gear and a single catapult, only to facilitate the movement of aircraft from her to other ships. But she's not an aircraft carrier. She has 2 hangars, each 16 foot 6 inches high. The aircraft are transportable between the hangars and the flight deck by the 2 lifts. The forward lift is a nice one of roughly 33 by 45 feet, and the rear one's 24 by 46 feet. So slightly differing lengths and shapes to fit the aircraft which might be coming. There's a debate as to whether she could carry 33 or 36 operational aircraft. I've used, I think, 36 in the vitals next, but there is a debate, so I want to mention that. She carried a lot of fuel, she carried all sorts of things, and I'll be getting into the vitals in a second, but she is not an aircraft carrier. The reason she's able to not be considered an aircraft carrier is because all of her stats are about sustainment of aircraft. She is built there to support the Illustrious class, to provide the extra depth, because the British do realise that they can't carry as many aircraft on their ships as the Americans do. And by that, I don't mean operational air group, I mean carry as many aircraft. Okay? The Americans store theirs up in the rafters, as the Japanese do all sorts of fun things. And the British store some boxed on ships, but then it's not the same. They have a large depth of stores, but it's not the same. They don't have ready-to-fly aircraft. And also, the Illustrious class, unlike Ark Royal, do not have a second hangar down below they can use for deep maintenance, repair, and basically rebuilding from scratch, which Ark Royal does quite often. So that's a real limitation on them. Because, again, of getting them in under the treaty limitation. But the British can build this under the treaty limitation. She is very specifically designed and defended in Parliament and all sorts of things as not being an aircraft carrier. She is an forward aviation support ship. She's only got one catapult. That's not going to be enough for combat operations. She's only got this, that, she's not designed for combat operations. And it might be true that her 4-inch guns actually do shore bombardment in the Korean War. But those 4-inch guns, well, if we're being specific, she has exactly 8 of them. Exactly 8 of them. Which, if we go back to the treaty, yeah, mount a gun, mount more than 8 guns with a caliber exceeding 3 inches. It works. It works. She's, and what's that? Designed for a speed no greater than 28 knots. It used to be 20 knots, but now it's 28 knots. And what can she do? 24 knots! Oh. Oh my. Oh my, oh my, oh my. Now, yes, a single catapult, yes. The rest of gear. But she was also originally designed to have a structure on the deck, sort of structure, as would appear on some of the successor vessels, which would also carry on the role that she outlived. And, yeah, she is most definitely not designed to operate aircraft. After all, the Royal Navy had no history of operating something which had a structure in the middle of the flight deck. They certainly couldn't figure out how to operate it. Or, alternatively, the Royal Navy has nobody aboard that ship. In a ship of up to 1,200 crew, no one in there would know how to use, I don't know, cutting torches and gears to remove various other gear, to remove a steel structure from the deck to make it flush. The sheer amount of work put into demonstrating that this thing was not an aircraft carrier almost managed to persuade even Churchill that he should continue its construction. He still did pause it under the carrier and capital ship construction pause, but it came very close to him not, which does represent a very interesting bit of diversion from fate, because considering what she was, and she would have been the only sort of carrier coming online at anything like appropriate amount of time, if she hadn't been paused, you could well have seen her wandering around, I don't know, the North Atlantic in 1941, in early 1941, if not earlier. As it is, she is laid down in June 1939, launched in November 1941 after the pause has been lifted, and completed in 43, because primarily the other carriers coming online are bigger, better carriers, and so they take precedence over her. But if she was the only thing being built which was remotely like an aircraft carrier, I can see her being in service by probably Feb, if not March 1941. I could see that. Now, yes, that'd be very quick, but pretty much she'd be the only major ship being built, so you can imagine how the Royal Navy would have put a rush job on that thing. And it's not as if she's got a huge armour belt or anything. She's got arm around the magazines, arm around the bulkheads, but that's just bulkhead thickness mostly, and flight decks. Yeah, that's not a lot of effort for the British maritime industry and infrastructure to put together. Especially when you consider where Unicorn is being built. She's being built by Harland Wolff in Belfast. Again, not exactly a yard which is not known for being able to put a spurt on when it's needed to. So she could have been rapidly delivered. It would still have been, let's see, June till March 1941. She would have been built in 21 months. Just under 2 years, built and commissioned. Again, it's not an impossible feat. Especially if you consider the depth of infrastructure industry you're talking about. Would that have made a big difference? Well, you can ask yourselves that, but you can also ask us, she could have been available at Denmark Strait. If she's not completed then, let's say she's completed in June 1941. Well, she could have been dispatched with Force Z as better than nothing. She's running runs the Salerno campaign mainly because of that. There's not a, they don't want to send a big fleet carrier in. They want to send something in to support the escort carriers, which are being used as strike carriers to make sure they can keep working, keep sea fires going. This is the good thing to pick from, and she does all sorts of other duties like that. So, yeah, I could see her having been used and sent off with Force Z. So she could have been with Repulse and Prince of Wales. Does that mean they survive? Quite possibly. Quite possibly, because probably 18 fighters and 18 strike aircraft would be her air group. She could support and sustain that. What kind of fighters they'd be? Not sure, but there again, if we consider the state the aircraft attacking Force C were in, they wouldn't have been in that great a condition themselves. Which changes all sorts of little bits of history. But the point is, she wasn't. She wasn't available. She wasn't there. And the fact that the Wash almost worked on Churchill, you have to wonder if there'd been someone more experienced there as Third Sea Lord, rather than poor Fraser, who took over from Henderson, not with the normal handover, but Henderson had died, and they're scrabbling around to pick anyone who is remotely technically capable and qualified to actually do the job, and Fraser is the closest potential candidate. Well, you have to admit, if there'd been anyone slightly more experienced, they might well have hidden her and got her through. Considering some of the ships they do get through, and the fact that she comes close to being ignored by the Order, a little bit more experience, a little bit more effort in how they say things and persuade things, might have even worked on Churchill and got her through. It's one of my favourite what might have beens. Mainly because this is the last ship, as I put earlier, pretty much the last naval aircraft carrier design that Henderson signs off on. And it's therefore the last of the ones he worked on directly. All the rest are sort of descendants of his designs, and the designs he worked on, but this is the last design he was really involved in. And it seems a shame to me it doesn't get a more prominent part in World War II because of that, because that's the man who, for all its faults and all its great points, took responsibility and was pretty much in charge of building virtually the entire Royal Navy that was new build prior to World War II and shaping the Navy that was built in during World War II. The only decision he did not take the blame for was the 14-inch guns on the King George V's. I think there's a whole debate as to whether 16-inch or 15-inch would be better. I think, honestly, from some of my writings, I think he would have gone 15-inch guns. And the reason I'm saying this in concert is because there's a similar reason why from the shaping on the form of Unicorn. Henderson's designs were all about logistics. They were all about global development and global stretch, and about getting the multiplicity out of the designs and the forces. The reason this design is chosen and is pushed forward like it is because it does give the Royal Navy a rapidly able to be built, a rapidly constructible, decent fleet carrier. It's not a great fleet carrier design, it's not a supreme fleet carrier design, but it's a worked out, thought through design that's rapidly made into a light fleet carrier. And it's already been built, it's already been tested, it's already been worked out. Henderson was all about that. And one of the things that I think he was quite keen on the idea of doing was standardization and improvement. And the 15-inch gun was the most common gun in the Royal Navy at this time. They had the Queen Elizabeths, they had the R's, they had Hood, Renown, Repulse, all with 15-inch guns. An improved 15-inch gun that you could then retrofit to all of them, that's a big enhancement to the whole fleet. And that's the ethos. This vessel is an enhancement to a whole fleet. It's able to give you new aircraft. It's able to repair aircraft which are damaged. It's got a lighter which can be dropped down and go and pick up. It's self-propelled lighter that can be dropped down, go pick up aircraft from the shore, or aircraft which would be damaged, or aircraft which are damaged from other carriers, bring them back aboard and strip them down for parts to repair them, or to get usable parts off damaged aircraft so they can be used to repair other aircraft. Everything is about sustaining that fleet at the other side of the world. That's her concept. She is about supporting a fleet operating the other side of the world from their logistics and technological industrial hub. She's entirely shaped around that. She's not an aircraft carrier. She's a forward aviation support ship. The fact that the difference between her and an aircraft carrier is a paper-thin definition will leave to one side. She is built to be this mobile hub for the Royal Navy. Something which pretty much no other Navy develops or even considers having. Because they don't need to. The Americans are thinking about working from an ocean which is connected to them directly, and which they plan to build hubs hubs as they go across on various islands so they capture them. That's part of War Plan Orange from a very early point. The Japanese are planning on fighting a war which is slowly getting closer to the home islands that they then defeat Toshima style in detail once they've worn the enemy down. Again, they don't need this. The only ones who are thinking about fighting possibly a long-term conflict on the other side of the world from their industrial base, from their logistics base, from their hub, their geocentric centra. Geostrategic and geocentric center. I think I said centra earlier. I wonder what that word is. Maybe it's a new one I can come up with for academia. Is the reason and is the entire methodology behind they're developing vessels like this. They've also got the mobile naval basing units, the MONABs, which are really cool. But Unicorn is a part of that strategy. It's a part of the strategy of being able to move forces forward, of projecting them, of being able to logistically support them. So yes, she fulfills many roles. And that is the beauty of the Henderson-Goodall partnership. Every single design that they produce has a multiple, how do I put this, values. They can fill in multiple different categories. They can provide you with a critical asset in this way or a critical asset in that way. They are just amazing. Now, most historians rightly point to this concept of this idea of this sort of, for want of a better word, aviation tender, aircraft tender. Because it is kind of like the depot and depot ships or destroyer and submarine tenders used. So just to support aviation. As the Abyssinia crisis in 1934-35 against Italy in the Mediterranean. When the Royal Navy thought, hang on, what happens if our logistics to support our Mediterranean fleet has to go around Africa? Oh, frigate! And that's usually the point, and collective pointing of that. But I would argue it's actually earlier. Yes, that does have a major feature and a major factor in getting a wider Navy on side and showing them this as a solution, and in building up the Navy to support this idea, and also certainly in getting the wider government support, which goes into the very interesting and slightly suspicious wording of that. Because once you've deleted that the number of aircraft it can operate or all sorts of things from the criteria, and reduced it down to primarily for operating aircraft at sea. Well, it's maintenance aircraft is primarily for maintaining aircraft, not for operating aircraft, for maintaining aircraft. And it doesn't have, it only has one aircraft launching apparatus. You know, it's they've deleted fitted to receive aircraft on board from the air. The moment that's gone, okay, fine, you can receive aircraft. You can have the landing facilities for them. You can have the full-length flight deck to an extent. And more than 3 aircraft? Well, that's also gone. Once those criteria are gone, you've made a huge amount of space, huge amount of leeway for you to push forward. And the Abyssinia crisis gives you more evidence. But why am I saying that's not necessarily the cornerstone of it, the starting point of it? Well, I put it back to 1930, okay? Admiral Henderson at that point is not the third Sea Lord. He's the first Rear Admiral aircraft carriers of the Royal Navy. While he's doing that, he's operating multiple carriers in an exercise. And he's dealing with the attrition. He's also dealing with the reality of maintaining those aircraft and maintaining the supplies and the stores. And because the British tend to back up exercises one after the other, he actually got an idea in many ways of what a campaign attrition might be like on his aircraft. And interesting enough, he starts to make the case even then for a supply ship, a support ship that can deliver completed aircraft. It's one of the interesting things you find with the way Henderson and, to an extent, other admirals like Blackhouse at the time and a few others around there work, is that they start off with almost innocuous memoranda. Words and concepts initially put into exercise reports, etc., that grow and slowly develop over time. So they almost build their own weight. They build their own foundation. They seep it into the Admiralty thinking almost subversively. And they slowly build this to the point at which, by the time they're probably proposing after the Abyssinia crisis, what we need is this ship. The trouble is the treaty won't last. Oh, good. The Second London Naval Treaty is being the treaty's going to be renegotiated next year. Right, and these are the criteria we need it to meet. And they've allowed themselves a room of up to 28 knots. That's nice. That's useful. End up not needing it, but they go for up to 28 knots. Well, the moment they've done that, they're working that through. It's the point at which the people involved in it are almost sort of going, well, this is the accepted position. They're not. What are they arguing against? This is the accepted position. It's been our position for years. It's not the third Sea Lord, the control of the Navy. He's not forcing his ideas through. It's something which we all agree on, isn't it? We've all been talking about this for such a long time. We've been talking about this for nearly 10 years by the time it's ordered. We came up with this, didn't we? It's a long game. It really is a long game, but if you consider how institutions work, institutional memory, cultural memory really does work when you're trying to deliver things, the long game is often the smart game. You can change a lot. A small active group, or even an individual within a larger organization, can change a lot within an organization, not by trying to make waves and moving things quickly, but by taking their time and slowly building their case. To the point at which, by the time they're openly making their case, everyone already assumes that is the case. And arguing against that's like arguing against yourself, because you're part of the organization. That case is part of the organization, therefore it's part of you. And there were arguments put up against it. They were just, by this point, very quiet and very over there. And they were mollified by Henderson very carefully. So that's Unicorn. So let's consider her career, and this is another really interesting picture to consider, because the vessel in front is the fleet carrier. The vessel in front is the big ship. That is HMS Illustrious. In 1944, probably at Trimcommely Ceylon. Unicorn is behind her. And you can tell that Unicorn is a double hangar carrier, 2 hangar level carrier, or rather forward aviation support ship. You can also see the space for the lighter to be taken up about here, and it to be covered up and etc. But when you start looking at them, you can see some real parts of how the lineage of the Illustrious class and Ark Royal, remember, which had a similar height as Unicorn. It's one of the things I always find funny when people go, Unicorn is only built to support the Illustrious class. She, nothing to do with Ark Royal, etc. And you sort of go, put her next to Ark Royal. You'll find that she's the closest in height to Ark Royal. There is a reason for this. You look at these ships, you are looking at the cornerstone of, in many ways, Henderson's within the treaty limits plan for how to provide the Royal Navy with aviation capability. And again, I do not think, and I am sure of that Unicorn was not going to be a solo sister. They were going to build more of them. They hadn't ordered them. They were ordering one. They were going to probably build it. She was going to be, and they're probably going to order the next one, 1940. Next one, 1941. After all, they're auxiliaries. You can build as many of them as you like. That's a core part of auxiliaries. You can build as many as you like. You have no cumulative tonnage limitations. You have no limitations at all. You can build as many of these as you like. The only problem for Britain is not building enough to arouse massive suspicion. So ordering a batch of 16 of them would have caused a problem. Ordering one, and then ordering another one, and ordering another one, and preparing for war from 1942 onwards, they could end up with 4 or 5 of these ships in the service and never triggered a treaty. Never triggered a treaty. Will you find that written down anywhere? I doubt it. Do I think the Royal Navy would have followed it? Yes. The reason I don't think it would have been written down anywhere, because if you actually write that down anywhere, you are asking for trouble. That's another thing with organizations. If they're dealing with treaties and diplomacy and issues where if some of their decisions become public, they are going to cause issues on the international stage, you just don't write it down. You rely on the institutional memory to pass it on. What 1/3 Sea Lord teaches their successor. What the first Sea Lord tells their successor. What the second Sea Lord tells their successor. Audibly, verbally. In the confines of their office. What their deputies pass on. You can all keep it quiet. They don't have to write it down. You can all remember, yeah, we're ordering one at a time, but we're going to end up needing one at a time. And we're going to justify them as one for the Mediterranean fleet, one for the Far Eastern area to support operations in China, one for the Indian Ocean to support operations in there, because again, we have no infrastructure, so we need them. And we'll have a 4th one for the home fleet, maybe, that, so that we can rotate them around when we need to go for maintenance. It all makes sense. No one can really argue against that logic. And the Royal Navy could end up with 4 more, honestly not aircraft carriers, forward aviation support ships in service. Could end up with all 4 in service by 1942 if they decide to do it. If they build one and then they go, let's order 2, and then let's order 1 more. They could have done that. That didn't happen. Instead, what happens is we get the light fleet carriers. Because wars happened, and frankly, the treaties don't count anymore, so we can go for a full-on carrier. In light fleet carrier form. And we can build them as we wish to. So we do. But that doesn't stop Unicorn having a pretty darn cool career. As already mentioned, she's the only aircraft carrier to date to carry out shore bombardment. I do love, there's a great story about, I think it was think it was the Wisconsin, which, when she was fired on by a North Korean battery, returned fire with all her 16-inch guns, and a destroyer signaled to her, testy, testy. Or no, temper, temper. The British didn't even signal unicorn. They just went, yep, that's a British carrier. That's what they do. We're just not getting there, you know. We're just not getting into this. So, what was her career like? Well, when she starts working up, the first thing that has to be noted is that the Admiralty, to save time, didn't complete her with all her maintenance equipment and her full of repair equipment. In fact, they kept some of it off her, which allowed her to actually perform better as an aircraft carrier. That's just so surprising. So surprised. It was also most of the equipment which would have been on her deck, which was why she was going to be a forward aviation support ship, not an aircraft carrier. But apparently she does the job perfectly well without it, because it never seems to be properly refitted. So, yes, I'll leave that all to your assessment. She starts working up first with aircraft from 818 and 824 squadrons. They are Fairey Swordfish. She starts working up with roughly 15 aircraft aboard. Then she gets 9 Submarine Seafire 2 Seafighters from 887 Squadron. And once they're all embarked, she takes part in escorting Convoy MKF. And first things first, why is she only carrying, if her capacity is 33 to 36 aircraft, why is she only carrying 24? Well, that's because she's also carrying some Royal Air Force Bristol Beaufighters, which are got aboard via lighter and uploaded in the back there, so that they can be carried to Gibraltar. Great thing she can do. She can do that. No one else, no other ship can. She can do that. She then escorts the returning convoy from Gibraltar back to the UK. And then once she's back in the UK, she joins up with Illustrious. Yeah, they're seen later at Ceylon, but there's a reason why I have this lovely picture of them together, because they do spend a lot of time together with Illustrious, and does a sweep up on the Norwegian coast. This was part of Operation Governor, which was a diversion for the landings in Sicily. The idea was to make the Germans especially, but the Axis generally, think that the Allies were going to land in Norway. They were going to attack the Scandinavian hub of the Axis forces to try and better seal in the German Navy. Instead, of course, they went for the soft underbelly, but, you know, it was a nice thing to make them think, and these two going up and down the coast doing lovely little forays was a real excuse for them to believe that. As part of that operation, it should be noted that the Joyous of 887 Squadron and their Submarine Seafires were disembarked. They decided to go with the Sea Hurricanes of 800 Squadron as a better option for North Atlantic operations. It was already understood that the Seafire, for all its merits as an aircraft once in the air, was not really a good aircraft for catabar carrier operations. Now, by that I mean catapult-assisted takeoff and barrier-assisted recovery. Barrier-assisted recovery is basically a controlled crash. There's not really much control over it, but it is basically a controlled crash. And you have to be very careful in how you design an aircraft for it. Sometimes these days it's seen as so normal, so standard, because of the huge American carriers involved in it, that people consider it the easy option, or the standard option for carrier operations. There's nothing standard about a controlled crash and being designed to resist it. There's nothing easy for the airframe. And the Seafire suffered, but the Sea Hurricane was slightly more rugged. After Operation Governor, she goes on to Operation Avalanche, where, under the command of Philip Vian, who is her admiral and she has his flag aboard, she is the lead ship of Force V, which are providing direct support to the Allied troops ashore at Salerno and going ashore. She disembarked all her swordfish, barring 3 from 818, which she maintained because, frankly, Vian and a fair number of aviation officers wanted to have the self-defense detachment of swordfish torpedo bombers, both for anti-submarine operations and for maybe anti-surface operations if they needed them. It was better to have some aboard, so they took 3. There was a debate as to whether to take 3 or 6, and really that comes up more from the perspective of they're also getting rid of the Sea Hurricanes from 800 Squadron and replacing them with Seafires from 809 and 897 Squadron. They also get 887 back, and they each have 10 Seafires aboard. And that gives them a total of 30 Seafires and 3, just 3, Swordfish. So that's where you get the 33 operational aircraft from. Again, it's an interesting thing. If you consider this is a hangar which takes Beaufighters and still operates and maintains 24 aircraft in its 2 hangars, and can conceivably operate more, I would say the 33 to 36 is with a lot of stores. A lot of stores. Which is part of the reason for her, and it's part of her capacity standards. She managed to maintain 75 sorties on the first day of operations, and 60 on the 10th of September. The main problem with her for generating sorties wasn't her system. It turned out the catapult and barrier system she had and the other things were incredibly efficient. I mean, but honestly, a single catapult is not enough for a carrier. It's not enough. Not enough to make her a carrier. Not enough to make her a carrier. She's a forward aviation support ship. Please do remember that. Even though she's doing these duties, she's still a forward aviation support ship. She's a flagship of a carrier strike force, but she is a forward aviation support ship. Still, they keep losing aircraft. And the reason they dropped down to 44 sorties on the 11th of September and 18 on the 12th of September was despite Unicorn's mechanics, actually the fitters, the mechanics, the aero engineers, and there is a reason why I'm using the phrase mechanics, because some of the ship's engineers actually came up to help them. I'm not sure if they were just passing parts or helping them by providing extra muscle because they're also tired. Work through the night, and managed to repair 10 Seafires between the 11th and the 12th, and still they were short. They actually took fighters from Illustrious and Formidable that were supposed to be providing distant cover against any fleet actions or issues, and staged forward from Unicorn to provide air cover over the landings. It does improve on the 12th and 13th September when they're able to fly Seafires from the field ashore, because it turns out the Seafires can take rough landings. They just can't take crash landings. And so they managed to start to move aircraft to operate from temporary facilities ashore, and that's far better for them. She returns to the UK on 20th September, offloading what was a very full load of damaged Seafires and what remained of her own aircraft. They were all put ashore in Glasgow to be repaired. And she at the same time is refitted and reconfigured to aircraft repair ship from Carrier. She has some of those facilities fitted. I mean, I'm looking at the picture now on the screen again, and on the big screen here, and yeah, she really looks like she's stopped being an aircraft carrier. She then goes off in December 1943 to join Illustrious, Renown, Queen Elizabeth and Valiant as reinforcements for the Eastern Fleet. She took 4 Swordfish from 818 Squadron to protect herself. She delivered a group of aircraft to Cochin, India, to support them in January 1944, and then went on to Trimcommely, Ceylon, arriving there on the 2nd of February 1944. She was going to be used for not just repair duties, but also for deck landing practice. She had a little quick refit in Bombay during May. I'm sure no one designed it so that that would be able to rhyme, but it does kind of. And then in August, 818 Squadron was transferred to Affling and then disbanded. And in November, 817 Squadron flies aboard, and they are now providing anti-submarine protection with their ferry Barracudas. Oh yeah, she's been upgraded to Barracudas. And Unicorn goes to South Africa. Durban. To be modified with separate workshops and additional equipment to accommodate American engines as well as British engines, as they used different screw threads and electrical fittings. This is not making the British engineers and mechanics and fitters any happier, but it is necessary for logistic needs, so what do? You modify your mobile logistics hub to support you. Shortly after that, she's transferred to the British Pacific Fleet. And by the way, Unicorn is another reason why the British Pacific Fleet is interesting in the American operations scenario when they're operating alongside the American task forces. Because the American task forces keep looking at Unicorn and going, "We covet your weird-looking carrier. We covet it greatly. The things it does is interesting. Yes, we get new aircraft delivered, but that thing does all sorts of strange creations and field modifications. We covet it." I am not quite sure if this is a true quote, but this is a quote passed down through my family from a Fleet Air Arm officer at the time. And he met up with some of his American colleagues from that time many years later. And they were discussing the various carriers that were operating in the Pacific at the time. And the American used the phrase, "What was that ship which was basically like you had a carrier full of redneck mechanics on board? What was it?" It was Unicorn. Now, that was told to me at a Christmas. Ooh, it must have been the year I started my PhD, so well over a decade ago, and the gentleman is now since no longer in this world. So I cannot verify it. But I rather like it as a description. I think as a description it kind of fits Unicorn, because of what she does. And that gets illustrated as we go on with her career, because very quickly she returns from Durban to Ceylon, and then she picks up engines, aircraft, 120 engines, 82 new aircraft, takes them, basically empties the stocks of the Eastern Fleet, and takes them to Sydney. Once she arrives in Sydney on 12th of February, she disembarks all her aircraft, all the stuff, and then she goes to Manus Island, the Admiralty Islands, and there she starts support the BPF's training before Operation Iceberg. Now, Operation Iceberg is the battle fought for the Battle of sort of Okinawa. It's part of the Battle of Okinawa, and she arrived at San Pedro Bay, Philippines, on the 27th of March. And that was to serve as the BPF's intermediate, we're going to call it, replenishment base, but really, to an extent, it's almost the primary forward base, and everything but after that is subsidiary bases. The British are going off to attack the Japanese airfields at Sakishima Islands and Formosa. And Unicorn's primarily purposed with preparing aircraft for issue to operational squadrons. So, taking new aircraft when they arrive, making sure they're ready, and then giving them to the fleet carriers during this time. But she still was doing repair, modification, and service. In fact, she managed to repair, modify, or service. And by the way, if you're sending the aircraft to be serviced on Unicorn, it basically means rebuilt. Roughly 105 aircraft between March and May 1945. 105 aircraft. Think of that from a construction, supply, and logistics perspective. That's 105 aircraft you've had to replace. Think of where they're going to come from, how you're going to get them forward. And the modify is really an interesting one, because Redneck engineering, or as we might call it in the UK, that'll do engineering, was rife. It worked. That'll do. But it was a case of, oh my. She then went to Australia on 22nd May, arrived at Sydney 1st of June, and then she went to Brisbane to have her bottom cleaned at Cairncross Dockyard and to load more replacement aircraft. She returned to Manus on the 22nd of July and prepared for operations off Japan. Think about her capabilities in any operation against Japan. Think about the critical nature of supplying forces, the reality of the kamikazes and other systems which were likely to be faced. The Allies were working out those numbers. An asset like Unicorn was going to be worth her weight in gold, in maintaining the strength of forces and carrier groups operating around Japan until they could have firm enough bases ashore. And she actually served at Manus till Japan surrendered in 15th August, and then she was tasked with ferrying aircraft, equipment and personnel back to Australia after surrender. She departed for the UK in December 1945, and she arrives in Plymouth in January 1946, where she is immediately placed in reserve. And she's almost, put to one side. Until 1949. Ah, yes, 1949. There are issues going on in the world. She's reactivated for service in the Far East to support HMS Triumph. She sails from Devonport on 22nd of September with a cargo hold and a hangar and every other storage base that she has aboard her, full of Seafires and Fireflies. When the Korean War breaks out in June 1950, she was already disembarking aircraft. She was preparing to carry equipment and maintenance personnel and everything else at RAF Sabang in Singapore, and she was supposed to be preparing to return home and then back to reserve. But instead, the Admiralty ordered her to be used as a replenishment carrier, ferrying replacement aircraft and supplies to the Royal Navy and the Commonwealth Navy's aircraft carriers operating in Korean waters. So her duties are going to be a lot of trips to Singapore and a lot of trips to Sasebo in Japan. She arrived at Sasebo and transferred 7 Seafires and 5 Fireflies to Triumph on the 20th of July. She then ferried the 1st Battalion, the Middlesex Regiment, and the headquarters of the 27th Brigade from Hong Kong to Busan and arrived there on 29th of August. She then delivered supplies to Sasebo before returning to Singapore to begin a refit. Why? Because she'd been activated for a ferry mission, and now she was going to have to do other things, so they needed to quickly check those other things were going to work. She resumed her duties in December, taking 400 troops, plus the usual aircraft, stores and equipment, and I love that phrase, usual aircraft, stores and equipment. Basically, she was full of everything on her route. She was used for pilots for deck landing practice whilst en route, and part of her ferry load included Gloucester Meteor jet fighters from No. 77 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, going up to Japan. She's a real force multiplication asset at this point. She remained in Japan and off the coast of Korea for roughly 3 months, primarily being used as an accommodation ship but also supporting other duties, and then she resumed her role as a ferry carrier. Whilst transiting the Shimonoseki Strait on 2nd of October, she destroyed the power cables, the overhead power cables, which stretched between Honshu and Kyushu, as they were sagging low due to heavy snowfall, and no one had warned her that they might be doing so. And of course, she's an aircraft carrier. Aircraft carrier versus cables. There's damage, but she usually wins the fight. On 21st of November, Unicorn and HMS Warrior exchanged crews at Singapore, and then Unicorn carried out a refit. A refit afterwards. That's completed in January 1952, and she returned to her ferry duties. In April, she was adopted by the Middlesex Regiment. This is an interesting issue as to how many ships are actually honoured by an army regiment. But the Middlesexes seem to be very proud of their association with HMS Unicorn for many years. That association, I think, from my knowledge, continues to this day with the association, the Veterans Associations. I think they still have a very close relationship and a very close friendship going on. Now, subsequent to that, she links up with HMS Ocean and she's doing operations with her, and they have a very interesting symbiotic relationship. Because it starts out with her being basically the spare flight deck for damaged aircraft on land, so Ocean can continue her strike operations. And then it moves on to her being the combat air patrol, as in the fighter aircraft for defense of the fleet carrier, when some of the Sea Furies from Ocean are transferred across to Unicorn. She does all sorts of lovely little operations like that, and even at one point is carrying around Admiral Roderick McGregor, the first Sea Lord. He's first Sea Lord from 1951 to 55, and he's probably the Royal Navy's biggest post-World War II, other than Caspar John, proponent of naval aviation and carrier air power. One of the things, again, that's often forgotten is the Royal Navy does have a few good admirals who are very, very pro-air carrier air power post-World War II, and they really are pushing for the Royal Navy to have a strong carrier force. It doesn't just become basically a submarine-orientated service straight off, although that certainly does happen later on. Mainly because of the submariners having the perisher course and so many things which make them stand out as an elite, which helps them with promotion boards. They are very good and very capable of expressing themselves. It's one of the troubles again with the Royal Navy and its lack of staff courses for a while. It's an interesting approach to staff work and staff training experience. It really does disenfranchise quite a lot of Royal Navy officers from getting the senior ranks for a period. It's remedied today and it's no longer the case, but it almost becomes a period where you're going, is there going to be another submariner reaching a point? Yes. And there's things of, it's a submarine mafia. And it's not really. It's because so many of their courses focus them in staff course and being quite erudite in explaining themselves, and they're so used to having to explain the submarine service to the surface navy when they're nuclear-powered vessels and different anyway. It gives them a real edge when explaining to non-naval personnel what they're doing, and it helps them with their promotions. But Unicorn keeps doing all these sorts of duties, and it's actually during this period that she conducts her shore bombardment when North Korean coast watchers at Chepeki Point start annoying her. So, she uses her 4-inch guns on them. It works. They stop annoying her. She then returned to Singapore for another refit, left there on July 1953. And it's while she's returning from Singapore to Japan. Sorry, why did I forget Japan then? Apologies. That she gets involved in another interesting incident in her career. And this is something I have to say I am still finding out more information about, but pretty much I found a very interesting PhD thesis while doing research on this. Well, actually, while finding the pictures of this, I found a PhD thesis from Taiwan. And it discussed an incident she was involved in. And then I did some other checkings into it and found it did happen. Okay. So I can't think of another aircraft carrier ever doing this, but I'd be really interested if you can find, because she's the only aircraft carrier, as far as I know, to ever do a bombardment offshore with her own guns. And I think she's the only aircraft ever to interfere in what is a piratical action, although not technically by pirates, because she hears a distress call from the SS Kilda, probably, which was just going through the Taiwan Strait, saying she's under attack by pirates. These pirates turn out to be gunboats of the Republic of China's Anti-Communist National Salvation Army, which is an interesting organization. And they close on the freighter's position at as high a speed as they can, and the gunboats decide that, frankly, Unicorn is a bit big for them to take on. And she circles the freighter with all guns, bearing and capable of firing. They go away. They leave it alone. I can't think of another aircraft carrier doing that. I also can't think of another aircraft which would really more appropriate to do that. than her, but she does. And then, of course, there's the Korean Armistice Agreement, which comes into effect actually the following day, which is probably why it's less well known, because this literally happens on the 26th of July, and then on 27th of July, the Korean Armistice Agreement comes into effect. So that's the big important thing of that period. She then accompanies Ocean on 2 further patrols to monitor the North Korean compliance with the armistice, and she sails home on the 15th of October, arriving on the 17th of November. And then there's a whole interesting discussion. Do we keep her or do we sell her? What do we do with her? The initial plan was to modernise her to make her capable of operating jet aircraft. That would have been fitting steam catapult, possibly reinforcing her flight deck, enlarging her forward lift, and also probably moving it as well. New crane necessary to handle the heavier aircraft, and they also were going to combine the 2 hangars so she'd have a massive space for super maintenance. And when I say super maintenance, that was actually a phrase I found in one of the books, and then I found a translation from that from a naval engineer somewhere else, which was basically rebuilding the aircraft entirely, but we're going to call it maintenance because that goes in a different budget point. Basically, I'm transcribing what he's saying, because he put that in a lot longer discussion than I was prepared to give it. And the idea was that the reconstruction would begin in July 1954, but it's abandoned in November 1952 because the cost of providing existing air carriers with fangled flight decks was considered far more important. So she's designated as a ferry carrier in June 1953. She's reduced to extended reserve in 1957, which means rather than short-term reserve where she can be activated quite quickly, she's put in deep reserve, and she's placed on the disposal list in 1958. She's broken up at Troon in 1960. And that's her end. What I do find most interesting then is the levels of reserve the Royal Navy used to have and consider necessary for a fleet. You had the short-term reserve, the ones which were able to be quickly activated, and you had the extended reserve, which were the deeper ones. Levels of ships in ordinary rather than in commission. A depth to your fleet, to your structure. So let's consider the summary. Let's consider what was Unicorn. She was a useful ship. She was a very useful ship. And she was a ship with a career like no other. There are no ships I can think of which have had the same career as Unicorn. I was looking for a interesting vessel to start off Key Ship Series 8, to really be the first ship of a new series starting off in 2024, the year of the aircraft carrier. And I was going through many different options. And I decided I would have to start with not an aircraft carrier. Because this is not an aircraft carrier. She's a forward aviation support ship. She goes around the world and supports other aircraft carriers. Yes, she acts as an aircraft carrier. She's still acting as an aircraft carrier in the Korean War. It's arguable when she's providing fighter cover for the fleet and all sorts of other things. But she's not an aircraft carrier. She's about making aircraft carriers work. And in a world where we have fewer and fewer carriers and are expecting them to do more and more work, maybe it's something we should remember in terms of the value of Unicorn. So, I'm going to give you 2 questions. One of them is my favourite topic from earlier, as I mentioned. You can put comments as to which is, what do you think happens if she is ignored by Churchill? If someone does manage, she is ignored by Churchill and it is completed really quickly. Said, she'd be the big ship that they could all concentrate on quickly getting through and fitting out. And let's be honest, there's going to be no competition for her going through fitting out, no competition at all. She's going to be pushed through. And March, April 1941, she's in service. What do you think happens? What do you think she's useful? What do you think she does? Is she there for the Denmark Strait? Is she there for 4C? Where do you think she is? What's she doing? And how useful do you think she'd be? And the second scenario question I want to give you is this. Do you think, if war doesn't start in 1939, if war is holding off, do you think the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy look at this and go, frigate, those have done it to us again, and start copying her? Or do they not, because it doesn't serve their needs? Because they can't justify an aviation support ship? Because I really do think that the Second London Treaty and this inclusion is a really interesting piece of foresight if we consider exactly what operating characteristics are. I'm not saying that someone designed the specifications with her in mind, but I do notice that the studies have been well underway for a long time before they're writing those requirements for that particular treaty. And what we've got coming up. Oh, there's a lot. Next week, conception, operation, conclusion of the Ark Royals. That's going to be a fun one. Thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, please like. If you would like to share the video, I'd be very happy if you did, because I'd like more people to see my videos. Because as I said before, naval history is a disease which it does not seem to be communicable, but I am doing my very best to infect as many people as I can of it. And thank you for watching. That'll make YouTube happy. They keep complaining I don't do enough of that. There are buttons down below to subscribe, share, join, all sorts of things. Members of the channel get all sorts of emojis as their main advantage. I also have Patreon and Ko-fi as well. There are links, I think they're up there, to support the work of the channel. And thank you very much to everyone who does, because, as I've said before, you're what make doing this sort of work viable, this public-facing history, this naval history. Without your support, no one's interested in funding it, really, in the UK much. And when they do want to fund it, they're talking about Age of Sail stuff or things like that, and which is very good history. Please note, I'm not saying it's not. I just want to do more. And it's you that's make that possible. It's you and your support that makes that possible. So thank you. Take care and hope you enjoyed.